My name is Scott Wesley. I'm a ruling elder from Wekiva Presbyterian. I'm really happy to be with you today. This is one of my favorite days of the year, Father's Day Eve. I really think it should be a national holiday as well. But anyway, I'm excited about that and excited to be with you. George is a tough act to follow, but I love to follow him because he always gives me something to think about and maybe something to put into my talk that connects them. Like Cheryl told us last week, how important it is to be a connectional community, and but it also hopefully enhances what I'm trying to say. Unlike Jeff and Cheryl and George, I am not taught by this. I don't have a seminary education. I'm an organizational psychologist. Simply means I take psychological theory and principles and apply them to issues in organizations. And churches are organizations too. Sometimes we forget that. There are interesting ones, they're challenging ones sometimes, but I have also tried to apply my knowledge and discipline to churches. And sometimes I've had success and sometimes, not so much. But I hope my experiences can inform the session today. I'm going to talk about, as the slide says, the relational side of church leadership. And in addition to being a psychologist, I teach an online graduate course at the University of Oklahoma. Obviously, it's online. I don't commute. And that class is on management and leadership theory. So hopefully I'll bring some of that information to you today as well. And as Cheryl mentioned, there's a handout that she sent yesterday with the Zoom invitation. I'm not going to specifically refer to that during the session, but it has a lot of the key information that I'm going to share with you. So I don't think you need to take extensive notes, just try to listen. Hopefully you'll hear something that will be useful to you as you lead your churches. So I'm going to flip over to my agenda today, and I'm going to start by asking a couple of simple questions. Are relationships important to God? And I don't want to be a spoiler, but the answer is yes. And then we'll look at some leadership definitions and some models, and I'll attempt to make a case for the important role that relationships play in both. We'll look at a couple of relationship skills that I think are particularly important for leaders in churches today. We'll then look at a couple of, look at some of the challenges and pleasant features of relating to church members, and we'll look at some special relationships or special situations in relational leadership, and those would be managing conflict and leading change. And I'll sort of close out the talk by giving you my thinking about church leadership for today and into the future, and hopefully inspire you with a call to action at the end. So if that's okay, and even if it's not, I'm going to get started. So here we go. So I'm going to invite you to use the chat feature. I know you're all muted right now. If the chat feature is too challenging for you, then feel free to unmute. But I'd like to ask you the first question, which is, what are some biblical examples of the importance of relationships? And if you can't find the chat feature, I think Alt-H will give it to you. Or is it Control-H? Alt-H, I think. So the question again is, what are some biblical examples of the importance of relationships? I can't find my chat, so I can't see what you're saying. Here we go.
On my laptop, it's a bar that stretches along the bottom with lots of different options, and there's
more, right? Oh, okay. So there's some good ones here already. Thank you. So we've got Joseph and his brothers, Adam and Eve, Paul's letters to all of those different cities and towns and churches, the disciples, Jesus and the disciples, Jesus and Mary, Martha and Lazarus. All of those are great examples of significant relationships. Jesus and Peter, Jesus and John, I'll throw in, the disciple that Jesus loved is how he's often referred to. David and Jonathan's another one that we sometimes talk about. Let's see if I've got any. Moses and Aaron, I think, is a good one. Paul and Timothy. The Trinity, I think, is a really good example of a relationship. It's, think of it, three entities from one essence. And that's kind of what we seek in our relationships, is to be of one heart and mind with our loved ones. So I think, great job. Thank you for participating in that. Point here is that healthy relationships with family and friends and with God, are one of the great blessings of life. They make life enjoyable. They make life fulfilling and life-giving. So, and I think, in the church, they help us cultivate community, foster care, provide mercy, and deliver hospitality. So they are important to us, and they are basically important to God. And we had a couple of really good examples in George's talk, where we started with that initial verse, how good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in harmony. And then there was a strong emphasis on the second commandment from Jesus, to love your neighbor as yourself. So again, really kind of a no-brainer. Relationships are important to God. So I'm going to switch to talking a little bit about some definitions here. And the first one, these are typical textbook definitions of leadership. So it's an interactional process, not a position. We often associate leadership with higher level positions, like a manager or a vice president, a CEO. But sometimes people in these positions are leaders, and sometimes they really aren't. They're more something else, like a manager. And I like the fact that leadership isn't defined or connected or constrained by a position. It means that anybody can be a leader. And that's kind of liberating. It gives organizations the potential to do a lot of really good work. The one place I can think of that's sort of an exception to that rule is the church, however, because if you think about how do we refer to people in the church who are officers? What do we call them? What's the other name that we use for them? Lay leaders, right? I mean, we call them leaders. So there is that expectation, if you are an elder or a deacon, that you also will be a leader. The second definition I like is creating the conditions for a team or group to do their best work. This definition brings into the fold the idea that you are working with a group of individuals or a team, and it talks about doing their best work, performing well, enabling them to perform well. The third definition is similar. The ability to engage others, build teams, and achieve results. So this one, again, emphasizes this idea of performance, achievement, but it also brings into the definition sort of human motivation and human development in terms of engaging others. Another way to think about engage, another term for that, is to inspire, like George said earlier, to breathe life into other people, to inspire them, and to build teams. So there's a development aspect to leadership as well. Bringing people together to combine their efforts to promote success and survival. There's a huge part of leadership that's about teamwork, about getting people to work together to combine their efforts. And again, we see the thing about promoting success. That what's kind of unique about this definition is it brings into that definition of success survival too. And I think part of that's historical, but part of it's relevant for today as well. If you think about back in history, when the world was a far more dangerous place, people often formed groups and villages to combine efforts to protect themselves, to survive. And leaders often emerged from these places because of their unique talents to help that group or village to survive, and I think today with the pandemic, a lot of organizations are dealing with this notion of surviving, and they're looking to their leaders to help them with that. And of course, this is not a new issue for a lot of churches. A lot of churches are worried about their legacy and their ability to, stay, have a future. The next definition, a process ordinary people use when they are bringing forth the best of themselves and others. And I really like this definition. It used to be my favorite definition, but I've got a new favorite definition, but I like this ordinary people. You think about the Bible has so many examples of ordinary people that have been in many cases promoted into leadership by God, by the situation and by His power. But they're ordinary people, and they're shown to be significant leaders. You think about Isaac or Moses, David as a boy when he defeated Goliath. The disciples were as ordinary as you can get, and yet they were the early distributors of the gospel. And I think we have this romantic notion still about leaders are born, and leaders have to have certain innate traits. They have to be tall, they have to be good looking, and they have to talk well, that kind of things. Well, there are enough examples of good leaders who are short and not so good looking. I think we can dispel this idea that you have to be born with certain traits to be a leader. A lot of leadership can be learned and developed. So I like that definition. And now my favorite definition, I've saved the best for last, is the longest also: energizing a community of people toward their own transformation in order to accomplish a shared mission in the face of a changing world. Okay, so there's a lot packed in here. We've got the energizing part, we've got the community of people, a group of people. We've got a new element, transformation. There's a part of leadership that's about changing people and making them better and improving their lives. And then there is a purpose. They have a shared mission, but there also is a dynamic context in which they have to lead and perform. And that's this ever-changing world that we're in that seems to be changing even faster these days than before. So the question I have is, what do these definitions have in common? And I'm not going to wait for your answer here. I'm just going to give it to you. One is that there is a, well, some of you did. The first thing is that leaders create the conditions for good performance by others. They enable that to happen. But that's not the key here, and that's not the purpose of my talk. The purpose of my talk is about relationships. All of these definitions have a relationship, or the notion of relationship built in. Leadership, by definition, requires other people to get the important work done, so relationships are very important. In leadership, I like the quote from John Maxwell: if you think you're leading but no one is following, then you're only taking a walk, right? You have to have a relationship with the people that you're trying to lead. So basically, bottom line, relationships are important to God. We learned that on the last slide. And relationships are important for leadership. So it's kind of a no-brainer that relationships are important for leaders of churches, right? So that's why we're here. That's why you're here. And let me try to give you some ideas of how you might use that information. So I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about some leadership models here. There are a lot of different models of leadership: situational leadership, transformational leadership, transactional leadership, charismatic, participative leadership, laissez-faire leadership, etc. But there are really two that I think are most relevant for our work in leading churches. And the first one is called authentic leadership. Authenticity is the alignment of head and mouth and heart and feet, thinking, saying, feeling, and doing the same thing consistently. What authenticity generates is trust, and followers like leaders they can trust. So authentic leaders act in a real, genuine, and sincere way that is true to who they are as individuals. Proponents of authentic leadership say this type of leader is best positioned to inspire trust, loyalty, and strong performance from other people. They are consistent. They don't act one way in public and a different way in private. They don't hide their mistakes or weaknesses out of fear of looking weak. So a key characteristic of authentic leaders is that they understand their purpose. At your churches, I imagine you have people who provide congregational care, and others who have a heart for mission, and others who care deeply about the building and the property, and others who teach. You know, these are all people that have found their purpose. And one of the great things about being a Presbyterian is that we have all of these different volunteer committees and groups where people can not only find their purpose, but fulfill their purpose in these ways. And as a leader, it's kind of our responsibility to help people find those niche activities that they can use to be more fulfilled and to provide a really great service to others. There's a strong emphasis these days about transparency, and I believe authentic leadership has become popular because of this emphasis on transparency. And so one question I have for you is, who you think of when you think of an authentic leader? And the first person that comes to mind for me is Billy Graham. I just get a sense, or had a sense of him when he was alive, that he was the same, whether he was on TV or in the pulpit or, at home, that this was an authentic individual. Other people say, Martin Luther King Jr. is a good example of an authentic leader. Oprah, the woman that everybody trusts, seems to be an authentic leader. Warren Buffett, who is in an industry that isn't really known for truth telling, seems to be about as honest a person as you can find. So I'm seeing some chats here. Tim Keller, right, great example. Thank you, Alberto. And having trouble with my mouse here. All right, I'm going to switch over and talk about servant leadership, which is the second model. And I think this one really is even, a better model for church leaders. It's certainly the leadership model that I believe is the most strongly connected to the Bible and to, Jesus and his teachings. The primary role of the leader, the servant leader, is to serve others, basically. And this is a very different kind of leadership. If you think about most organizations, they have this hierarchy, and the hierarchy looks like a pyramid, and employees and customers are at the bottom and leaders are at the top. But servant leadership really flips that structure upside down. It's employees and customers at the top and leaders at the bottom. So servant leaders have a number of characteristics. I'm just going to briefly touch on them. The first one is that they feel called or compelled to serve. They tend to be really good at listening to other people, and probably because they are such good listeners, they have empathy for others, the ability to change people's lives. The ability to see things as others do. Healing, and this is not medical healing so much as it is helping people, or the ability to change people's lives for the better, or to improve people's lives. Awareness. They have awareness of their own selves and strengths and weaknesses, but they also have a kind of a awareness of when things feel right and when they don't. They influence people through persuasion, as opposed, they use influence and cooperation to get results, not authority and power. Foresight is about having intuition about the past and the present and the future, and how those three things are connected and how knowledge of one informs action in the other. Stewardship. They hold the organization's resources in trust for future generations and for the greater good. They're also focused on growth and commitment of growth of people. They value learning and teaching and improvement. And lastly, they're about building community. Find ways to build social and task-related communities within their organization. So again, I'll ask the same question. Who's a good example of a servant leader? Okay, so the nursery school answer is Jesus, right? I mean, that's the answer that you always get when you ask a nursery school kids any kind of question. But it's true in this case. He's definitely on the short list of servant leaders. And then you've got people like Mother Teresa and Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, Albert Schweitzer, who's a missionary and doctor. And then I would encourage you to think of people at your church who you consider to be servant leaders. And this one's kind of hard sometimes because they don't self-promote. They're pretty humble typically. But if you can think of them, you should thank them because chances are they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting going on at the church right now. And my experience is they tend to be what I'll call the church's first responders. I don't mean they're the police or the firefighters or the medical staff at the church, but they're the first people to help. And they often help without being asked. They just do it because that's in their heart to do. So that's the two leadership models that I wanted to sort of present to you. And before I go on, I'm going to just ask if there are any questions. I'm about to segue to another section here. So anybody got a question? Hey, Pat, I see your hands raised.
Could you talk just for a minute about conceptualization? I heard you go from foresight to stewardship, and either missed
that one. Yeah, I'm sorry. All right.
Thank you.
So conceptual. I wish this comes out of a guy named Robert Greenleaf, who's kind of the original author on servant leadership, and he used the term conceptualization. I think it's probably better. A term that might work better is vision. They tend to have a sense of the right direction, the right purpose of the church. They're very well connected to the mission of the church or the mission of the group and where they should go. So they're a source for the vision, the future direction and vision. And they framed that up under the term conceptualization. Does that help?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, sure. Anybody else? Don't see. All right. Okay, I'm going to go on. So I'm going to switch over to some specific relational skills for church leaders. I apologize for these images. They're pre-pandemic ones. Anybody remember hugging or shaking hands at church? It's been a long time, hasn't it? So, these physical displays of love have been curtailed, but I don't think that means we can't maintain and even deepen relationships during this time. Kind of a commentary of mine. I don't like the term social distancing. I wish we would have used a term like physical distancing. That's what it actually is, because I think you can be physically distant yet socially and relationally connected. But I'm going to limit this to, there are a lot of relationship skills we could talk about here, but I'm aware of my time and aware of your attention span, so I'm going to limit it to just two that I think are particularly relevant today. And the first one I'm going to talk about is listening, okay? And it's kind of ironic. This is probably the most fundamental relationship skill, and everybody agrees how important it is, but it seems like as a species, we are getting worse and worse, at it. We live in a very distracted world, and listening has become a challenge. I like this scripture. You must understand this, my beloved. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, for your anger does not produce God's righteousness. That's out of James. There is a lot of unrest and upheaval in our country right now, and I'm, to be perfectly honest, often at a loss about what I can do about it. I can't tell you what it's like to be a young Black man in America. I can't even tell you what it's like to be a police officer here. But I think one thing I can do, and that we all can do, is listen. Listen and learn, and try to understand people's perspectives here. And I'm hopeful that if I listen well enough, that maybe I can be in a better position to help during times like this. So let me ask you, who is the president there?
FDR.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay. So, and this is a story about listening and FDR. So, and I learned this from Doug Lang, who is a fellow elder at Wekiva. So Roosevelt, like all presidents, often endured long receiving lines at the White House. He didn't really like these receiving lines, and he often complained that no one really paid any attention to what anybody said. So one day during a reception, he decided to try a little experiment. To each person who came down the line and shook his hand, he murmured this: "I murdered my grandmother this morning." Okay. So he did this, and surprisingly, or perhaps not, the guest responded with phrases that really confirmed his "nobody is paying attention" hypothesis. He said it, and they would say things like, "Marvelous. Keep up the good work, Mr. President. We are so proud of you, and God bless you, sir." It was not until the end of the line, while he was greeting the ambassador from Bolivia, that his words were actually heard. Not quite knowing what to say, the ambassador leaned over to the president and whispered, "Sir, I'm sure she had it coming." So I'm not, I hope you laughed. I can't hear you because you're muted, but I want to go from that little story. And I don't want to give you a bunch of suggestions about how to listen, because you've probably heard all the ones I would have to say anyway. I want to try a little small group activity. We're going to venture into breakout rooms one more time. Hopefully it'll work all right. So we're going to do an activity called Yes and. And the goal is pretty simple in this activity. In your group, you're going to make a story. The first person starts the story by saying a sentence that begins, "Once upon a time, there was a church and then they complete that sentence about that church. So they might say something like, "Once upon a time, there was a church and the people in that church loved each other," right? And then the next person adds a sentence to the story of their own, okay? But they have to start their sentence with the words "yes and," right? So yes and then they add something about that church, and you try to make it a coherent story, right? And a story that you can, that's believable. So that activity continues with each person taking a turn, adding a sentence to the story, and every time they add a sentence, they have to start it with yes and, okay? So I'm going to give you 3 minutes once you're in your breakout rooms, and Cheryl, if you're going to put us in them, that would be great.
How many would you like?
I'm sorry?
How many would you like? How many?
How many did we have for George's activity? 3?
We had 4.
Oh, okay. Sure, let's do 4. That gives you a little more participation.
Yes, and?
Yes, and then if you have your handout, there are some directions there for that. And if my co-leaders are in these different groups, if you could sort of help facilitate that. Cheryl, give us just 3 minutes. I'm already behind schedule, so don't give us any more time than that. And count how many sentences you can add. We'll see who wins this yes and activity.
Okay, here we go.
So are we all back? Yep.
Yes.
All right. So group one, how many sentences did you do?
Who's group one?
Group one.
I don't know.
Well, I'll just say we did 12.
Okay. All right. Did anybody do more than 12?
Mary, how many did we do?
Well,
Number one.
13. Oh. This is an honor system. We're going to talk about trust next. So, right.
We would have done a lot more if we wouldn't have started laughing after each one of the.
Well, good. I'm glad you got a little humor out of this. So I'm going to own up to something first, and that is that this doesn't come out of anything that I've read or studied about. It's not a psychology-based activity or a leadership-based activity. It actually comes from a completely different source, and it comes from improvisational comedy, okay? And if you think about improv, it's basically what you have to do in improv to be successful is you have to add to each other's ideas and keep the story going. The biggest sin to commit in improv is to say no or to disagree with what your partner has said before you. So they have to continue the story by saying yes and. What I like about this activity is that it helps you listen. You can't shut down and start thinking about your response in the middle of someone else talking because you've got to understand what they're saying to add to that story. And I think that happens so often in conversations is that we start listening to someone and then about halfway through their message, you start thinking about how am I going to respond here? Am I going to disagree with this person? How am I going to win? How am I going to make my point stronger than this person's point? And you miss out on a lot of what they have to say. And so that's why, I had to do this activity. When I gave this talk before live, back in, I think, February, Cheryl gave me this idea, and I really liked the idea. If you don't like it, blame me, don't blame Cheryl. But it goes something like this. I've worked with a number of churches, including my own, on different things, and I've heard people say something that sounds to me like this. Sonny, I know what this church needs. All this church needs is more butts in the pews, right? Butts in the pews. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but I've heard it more than once. That seems to be a lot of people's response. Get more butts in the pews, more people. Well, I think this is wrong on a couple of levels. First, if I'm picking body parts, butts aren't the first ones that come to mind. I'd rather have your hands or your heart or your mind, and maybe even your mouth sometimes. But I think what we need right now in our churches is more yes ands. We need more ideas. I'm kind of running dry on ideas. And I think, to bring the full intelligence and the full experience and skill of our congregations, we've got to listen to each other and build on each other. And so that's kind of the idea I have here on this yes and for you. So I'm going to switch over to what I consider a second really important skill, and that's trust. And there's a really good book on trust. It's called The Speed of Trust. It's by Stephen M.R. Covey. He's one of the sons of Stephen R. Covey, who you probably know wrote the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Now, the son maintains that trust is the one thing that changes everything, and that trust is a learnable skill. It's also a very fragile skill. It often takes years to build, but only seconds to break, and then forever to repair. And sometimes it can't be repaired. He talks about 4 trust pillars, and he has a really nice image of these pillars. It's like a tree, and at the root of the tree is integrity, honesty, and dependability. Do we honor our commitments? And then in the trunk is our intent. And by that, he means, what's your plan or your purpose? Are your motives aligned with your agenda and your behaviors? Are you, internally consistent? And do people understand that intent and see that intent as good? Capabilities, your talents, your attitudes, your skills, your knowledge, the gifts you bring to the church or to the table. These are important for leaders that are seeking trust or trusting relationships. And at the end of the day, results matter. Did your work lead to improvements? So that's kind of foundational level of trust. And he goes on to look at relationship trust behaviors. And there are 13. I won't go over all of them. I think some of the ones that I think are personally I like are listen first. Obviously, since I just talked about that. This idea that to earn trust, you have to first give it. You have to extend trust. Confront reality. It's good to be optimistic. It's good to be positive about the future, but sometimes you really have to look at the reality of the situation. Leaders have to face that reality because they have to lead their members through that. Another one is to get better. You're always trying to improve, get better. By attending this workshop today, you're showing a willingness to get better. And then the last one, we've talked about it already, is transparency. Create transparency. Don't hide. It's impossible these days to not be transparent. I mean, so much is whatever you say or do can come back to bless you or bite you. And so it's better to be transparent than to try to keep up with things that you may have said that weren't true. The last point I'll make about trust, that it has effects on speed and cost in relationships and trust. When there is trust, things can go quickly. And when things go quickly, costs go down, whether they're financial or emotional kind of costs. And when there isn't trust, things go very slowly and the costs are high. So it's really important to foster, generate trust with the people that you're leading. I'm going to switch over now to talking about relationship skills and relating to church members. And again, these are pre-pandemic images. I'm hopeful one day, we'll have pictures again like these, but not right now.
Scott, can you
Yes.
share your screen?
Oh, am I not? All right. How long has this been going on?
Since the break rooms, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, geez, sorry. I'm so sorry. Let me see.
It made me pay a whole lot more attention to what you were saying.
Yeah.
So
All
good.
right. Zoom, I love Zoom, but I have the hardest time finding it again. All right, here.
If
here's
we had our
screen.
handouts, we could follow along.
Yeah, well, all right. So it was only just this one slide, so I'll just go back to it real quick. Do you see my screen again?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I said, basically. All right, and it is all on that handout. All right, so this is going to go quick. How many black dots do you see? What do you see here? Do you see a duck? Do you see a rabbit? Do you see a ruck? A rabbit that's a duck? How about this one? Follow the stairs. Are those stairs that you could walk on? So the key idea here really is that people see and perceive the world differently, even when we're looking at the very same stimulus. And then I want to show you a couple more things. So is this tennis shoe teal and gray, or is it pink and white to you? I personally see teal and gray, but I'm told the actual color is pink and white, and try as I might, I don't see pink and white in that shoe. And some of you, I'm sure, can't see teal and gray. Here's some jeans. Are those white jeans or are they blue jeans? Or are they some kind of over-bleached jeans? I don't know. Here. And then the next one you've all probably seen, it's been a couple of years, but you might remember it, the dress, right? So what color is this dress? Is it blue and black? Or is it gold and white? This is another one. I cannot see blue and black in this dress, and I'm sure some of you can't see gold and white. And the point of showing you these images is that, you know, as amazing as our sense of sight is, it's not always 100% accurate. And what we see and the way we interpret may differ from the way others see the exact same thing. And it may be very difficult to see something the way that someone else sees it. You know, and we live in a time where it's very easy to kind of live in a vacuum, to find support online or in the news for whatever perspective we have, and that shuts us down from growing or learning or empathizing with other people that may have a different perspective than us. And my point in sharing these illusions with you is really that a lot of the issues that we have in relationships and organizations, including churches, kind of occur because people see and interpret things differently. So we have to work as leaders to hear these different perspectives and learn from them. So I'm going to have us do another activity. It's not going to be a group activity. It's or not a small group breakout activity. You do it individually. I'm going to show you a video. It's only about 30 seconds. There's two teams. They're going to pass a ball to each other. Okay. One team's wearing black shirts. They're going to pass the ball to each other. One team's wearing white shirts. They're going to pass the ball to each other. All you have to do is pay attention to the team in the white shirt and count the number of times they pass the ball. Okay? Watch them carefully. If you're not muted, don't talk out loud, don't count out loud or make any noises. And after the video, we'll determine which of you counted correctly. Okay?
Scott,
Yes.
you're in note. You're
Oh, my notes are.
PowerPoint.
So you're seeing everything. All right. Thanks.
Yeah. So if you
This
can
is
adjust it a
really
little
all
bit
right. Yeah. Okay.
easier to see
Thank
the
you.
video.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right. Let's try that again. I hit the wrong screen. Screen 2. Well, this is how not to do a Zoom presentation. So take notes. All right. Do you see my other screen now? Cheryl?
Yes, I do.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to click on the other screen. It'll start. You count, again, the team in white and how many times they pass the ball. It takes a couple of seconds for the video to start, so don't think that something's wrong. Here we go. All right. So if you counted 16, that was the correct number. And obviously, if you counted 16, you're a very good observer. Or are you? Did anyone see anything unusual in the video?
Both teams had balls.
Both teams had balls. They were both playing good.
A gorilla walked across.
Okay. Did you hear that, everybody? Did you see a gorilla in this? Okay. Did some of you not see a gorilla? And will own up to it?
I didn't.
Okay. How about the number of team members there were on the black team? How many did they have?
3.
3. How many did they have at the end of the video? All right. So just for those of you who didn't see, I'm going to replay the video. Let me go back a slide. I think it'll work that way.
You told us to focus on one thing, and that's what I focused on.
That's okay. I know. I tricked you. Okay. So watch it again. Don't count. Just watch and see what you see.
Okay.
Look for, maybe something strange, and look for how many team members are on the black team. All right.
There's the gorilla.
The gorilla, right?
Great. Didn't even see that.
And how many people on the black team now?
Two.
Yeah, the other one left right when the gorilla came in, I think. So anyway, so what's the point here? Well, I think sometimes, the point here is that we can just be so focused on seeing the world in a particular way that we miss things. We don't see the important things. The important thing probably in that video was not how many times the players passed the ball. It was the fact that a gorilla walked through the middle of the game. Again, really just an example for you as you think about the way you see the world, the way other people see the world, and why they're different perceptions of people. I mean, it kind of is what makes the world interesting, but it also can make the world frustrating sometimes. And often as leaders, we're dealing with these different perceptions and perspectives and the way people see the world. So I'm going to transition to another section, but I'll stop here and see if there are any questions for me. I don't have my chat up.
I'm not seeing any hands raised or
All right, thank you.
in the chat.
Okay, very good. We'll just keep going. So I'm going to talk about a couple of special leadership situations that I feel, have a strong relational component. The first one's managing conflict. And so one of the outcomes of seeing things differently is conflict. And the first thing that I'm going to say to you is kind of controversial, and that is that conflict is not bad. Okay, conflict is a sign that people care, that they have energy about a topic. But conflict can also be uncomfortable, and we often, don't like to be uncomfortable. So in churches, we often avoid conflict. But there's some real dangers to avoiding conflict. One danger is that you end up making some, bad decisions. You try to make everyone happy, and you end up making nobody happy. You end up with the lowest common denominator decisions. The decision is so modest that it really has no effect or impact. And then over time, if you continue to sort of avoid conflict and make modest decisions, you end up becoming, and the world changes around you, you end up becoming kind of irrelevant. You sink into irrelevancy. You have a vanilla ministry that really doesn't please anyone. The other thing that happens when conflict isn't addressed is that the people who are who don't mind conflict, kind of your most outspoken and divisive members, can get free rein, right? And they know that they can be that way because nobody's going to confront them, and you can have problems with that. That's happened in my own church before. So it's important that you manage conflict, manage it in an appropriate way, but in a healthy way, because it can be a real source for growth. And at a high level, there's sort of two, I can't go too deep today. At a high level, there's two types of conflict. One I'll call interpersonal conflict, and the other is a conflict over ideas or methods or programs. If you want some advice on interpersonal conflict, you can go to Matthew 18, verses 15 through 20. And this is the passage that says, if a person sins against you, you start by talking to them alone. And if that works, great. But if it doesn't, then you bring others to the conversation. And if that doesn't work, you might even have to bring it up in the church. But at its heart, this passage is really about, you work on conflict. You do it with grace. You do it face to face, not Facebook to Facebook, right? You try to restore the relationship. You work hard to try to restore the relationship. And what's interesting, I think, about this passage is that verse 20 is the one that I never knew was tied to this, but it's that famous verse about where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. Again, reinforcing just how important relationships are for people. And I think, God knowing that conflict can be difficult on relationships. The second kind of conflict, which is that conflict over ideas or methods or programs, what I can advise you on that is to look at your mission and let the mission decide the conflict here. Which of these ideas or programs best supports your mission? Of course, that means you have to be in touch with what your mission is. Why does your church exist? What purpose does it serve? And then if you have a clear understanding of that, and that's something you should have as a leader, then you can decide, which of these best supports the mission. If they both support the mission, then you've got to figure out how you do both, perhaps. But that's what I'll say about resolving conflict. Leading change. Okay, so this is the second one I want to talk about. Researchers estimate that anywhere from 50 to 75% of all change initiatives fail. And that means they fail to reach their objectives, okay? And I imagine all of you have lived through some kind of failed change initiative. And so rather than me telling you what doesn't work, I'm interested to hear it from you on this. And use chat or unmute yourselves. It's okay either way. I want to hear your ideas. What doesn't work? One thing I often hear about from my clients is when it's not communicated well, when there's not enough communication, change doesn't work. What else doesn't work for you guys? Have you experienced? Too much too soon, Cecil says. Great. Pat says, change attempted without first exploring and gaining buy-in. Imposed from the above without explanation. Yeah, exactly. Other things that you see that don't work or that haven't worked for you. Too fast. Yeah. And too slow, too. That also doesn't work. Unwillingness to even try. Yeah, doing nothing is not a good change strategy. or shutting it down too early is not a good change strategy. A lack of planning. It's not well documented and shared. Yeah, all good answers.
I have 2 churches do a year-long study on what they need to be doing and where their weaknesses are, and it comes out in a booklet. It's put on dust.
Yeah, it's one of those dust collectors that gets put on a shelf and acted upon, right? George has got a good one. What happens if you have a very, you take a vote and there's a winner, but it's not by much? How do you assume that that's consensus? How do you get just consensus from a topic that is pretty divided, right? We've never done it that way before. That's a good one. It's not contextual or pertinent. Yeah, that's another good one. And when it benefits only a few, right? Yeah, and you can see that in it. So those are all great answers, and they're all correct answers. I'm going to add a few to your list here. Yeah, here we go. So here are some others, and some of those you've already said. Couple that I'll comment on here. Let's see. We talked about going too fast or going too slow. What I see in churches a lot is depending on one person to lead it. And this is not just change, but depending on one person to lead almost anything. You can't give all the heavy lifting to your pastor or to certain individuals in the organization, especially something as difficult as change. It really needs a coalition of people. You really need a group of people spearheading and moving it and inspiring people to continue. Let's see. Not showing empathy. So here's another topic, another idea that you may not have thought about before, but resistance is a big part of change and overcoming resistance. And the thought I'll give you is that a lot of times people, it's not that they resist change so much as they resist loss or the perception of loss. They come to your church for a reason. And when you suggest a change, that may be perceived to them as a sacrifice or as a loss or something that they value that is going to go away, that you're not preserving that, right? And, and often we see people who resist as sort of the enemy, as somebody that's going against you. And I want you to be more gentle to these folks and to show a little empathy and to know, do you have an appreciation of what they might be going through with this change that's being suggested. All right, so there's some other ideas for you. But the one thing I'll tell you right off the bat is that change for a leader is not optional, right? What if we don't change anything at all and something magical just happens? Well, probably too many organizations wait for something, including churches, wait for something magical to happen, and it doesn't. So a key role for leaders is to create tension in your organizations. And I know that sounds strange, but I'll call it positive tension if that makes it better. And that tension is between where the organization is currently and where it could be. It's that gap. And for a church, the tension is the gap between where you are right now, what's the status quo, and where God wants your church to be. What's God's vision for your church, as well as you can discern it. That's the gap that needs to be brought up and illustrated for your members. Okay. But it's not optional anymore. So how do you lead through change? Here's a model of change. And I apologize to the math teachers out there. I know that an equation can't have both an equal sign and a greater than sign. But bear with me, I'll walk you through it. So C is just the amount of change that you can get. And what this equation says is that it's a product of follower dissatisfaction with the current state. M is the model of change, or I'll call it the vision of a better tomorrow. P is the process or plan. How will it happen? Does it make sense? Is it feasible? I'll go back to D because this is one that people often struggle with. You're telling me, Scott, that as a leader, my role is to make people upset. And my answer is yes, but it's upset with the current state. Upset that there's potential in your church that's not being realized. Upset that there's a gap between where you are and where God wants you to be. That's the kind of dissatisfaction that we're looking for. Dissatisfaction is the fuel that energizes action, okay? That's how you get people inspired and motivated to change, is through dissatisfaction and by painting a better picture, a brighter picture of tomorrow. The other thing that I'll say, and all of these things together have to be greater than resistance in order for change to happen. And the other thing that's important about this model is that it's a product, it's multiplicative, which means two things. One is, a small change in any one of these, positive change, can really have a significant impact on your outcome. And that's kind of the blessing of being a multiplicative model. But the curse of a multiplicative model is that if any of these things are absent, if any of these things are zero, well, we know what happens when you multiply anything by zero. Nothing happens, right? It turns out to be zero. So if you don't have all three of these things, dissatisfaction, it has to be broken and perceived to be broken. A model, a vision of a better tomorrow, and a plan and process to get there, then you're not going to have change. And that's probably why it's so hard for organizations to create change, because one or more of those components isn't there. Here are a few tips for leading change, and I'm going to have to go through these fast because I'm running out of time, but one is to create a sense of urgency. Unfortunately, leaders typically see the problem before everybody else does. And so one of the things that I often see leaders do or get frustrated by is that people don't get on board soon enough. What they forget is that they've been dealing with this problem longer than everybody else has, and they don't sort of sense that difference of timing here. So you have to be patient. Yes, it's okay to create a sense of urgency, but you can't go too fast and you can't do too much. I've already mentioned this second one. People don't resist change, they resist loss. As you're working in a church, you have to disappoint people at a rate they can absorb, okay? Again, that's probably a too fast or too much kind of discussion, but remember, they're not employees. They don't come to church for a paycheck. They come because they choose to. So you have to know them well and have good relationships to make sure that you don't run them off. There will be early adopters, and you have to raise them up and have them come alongside you because they'll have influence with the organization. Use your relationships here. One thing you can put off is the details around the plan. And if you can enlist the people in creating the plan, because you're going to enlist them to help you implement the plan, then that's a good strategy. Over communicate. The one thing I'm sure all of you have learned working in churches is that you cannot over communicate anything. No matter how many times it appears in the bulletin or in the newsletter or online on the website, someone will inevitably come up to you halfway through and say, now what's all this about this? Where did this come from, right? They just missed the boat on something. So you cannot, when it comes to something as important as change, you cannot over communicate it. Be prepared for the attack. Resistance may not go away, and one sign that you're actually having an impact is when people, attack the idea. And here, focus on the problem, not the people. Work hard on the problem, not the people. If you want to keep it, once it's started, you embed it in the culture. You do take steps to reinforce it. It becomes something that the church members take ownership in, have pride in. That's how you make it stick. The key message, though, as you're leading people through change, comes from a guy named Warren Bennis, who's he's passed away now, but a really thought leader in leadership. Two things that leaders have to do during the change process is to provide clarity and to provide hope, right? You do that through having clear, frequent communication delivered with confidence and optimism about a better tomorrow. And that's, and that's the thing that you have to do to be successful with change, clarity and hope. So, I'm sure you've heard the names Lewis and Clark, the great explorers. They were commissioned by Thomas Jefferson to explore the newly acquired western portion of the United States. Their mission was simple: just find a water passage to the Pacific Ocean. So starting at the end of August in 1803, they followed the Missouri River in canoes up to its origination in Montana. They firmly believed that the Columbia River, which flowed to the Pacific, was just to the west of where they were. If they could find the starting point of the Columbia, like they had found the starting point of the Missouri, they could use their canoes to get to the Pacific. Clark and 2 other men went ahead to scout for the Columbia. They climbed for a few miles to what is now called the Lemhi Pass in Montana. And they looked to the west, thinking that they would see the Columbia. And this is what they saw. Miles and miles and miles of mountains. So as you can imagine, at that moment, their hopes for a relatively easy journey evaporated. They were up a mountain with a canoe, not up a river without a paddle. They were up a mountain with a canoe. You couldn't have a more unuseful tool than that. They had 3 choices. They could turn around and go back to Jefferson and say that they were not able to complete the mission. They could continue north in hopes of finding another river flowing west, or they could go west as planned, go over the mountains and try to complete the mission. And we know from history that that third option is the one that they took. Guided by a 16-year-old and pregnant Native American named Pocahontas, they went into uncharted territory. They got horses from the Shoshone tribe. They went over the mountains, they found the Columbia, and they completed their mission to discover a water passage to the Pacific. So why do I tell you this story? Well, I tell you this story because I think and this story comes from a book that I'll mention in a moment, but I think most of our churches today have reached their own version of the Lemhi Pass. Our canoes have gotten us here. We have had many really good people paddling those canoes for, in some cases, a very long time. And some of you have been paddling those canoes, I know. And we owe it to these paddlers and to our current members and to our communities, and most of all to God, now to get out of these canoes, but to keep going. Our mission isn't over. It's going to be an adventure. It's going to be an adventure into uncharted territory, but you're the people who can lead that adventure in your churches. And you're likely going to need to tap into all of the skills and all of the resources that we've been talking about over the past 2 Saturdays. Lewis and Clark adapted to their situation, and so can you. So let me close by telling you a little bit. And the book that I'm talking about is aptly titled Canoeing the Mountains. It's by Todd Bolsinger, who is a Presbyterian pastor who now works at Fuller Seminary. I'm returning to my definition: energizing a community of people toward their own transformation in order to accomplish a shared mission in the face of a changing world. So the book makes the case for being adaptive as leaders. And to be adaptive, you have to be technically competent. George gave me this quote that I like a lot. It comes from John Paul II, Pope John Paul II. I remind those who do the work of the Lord not to neglect the Lord of their work. It's important that you continue to work on your technical competence as you lead. And however you do that, Sunday school, Bible study, self-study, stay competent technically. And do that because it gives you credibility and it gives you capability, which are important. Relational congruency is basically what I've been talking about today. It's largely being that same person at home, at church, at work, and out in the community, striving to be a person with the same values in every relationship and in every circumstance, especially and including the challenging ones. And I hope by now that you can see that what we've been talking about last week and this week fits well into these ideas of being technically competent and relationally congruent. And Bolsinger makes the case that you have to be adaptive. Adaptive capacity is that ability to be effective in an ever-changing world. And here are some of the skills that and behaviors that you need to show to be adaptive. Okay. Again, I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into detail on those. But the key message in the book is that, you have to let go of your canoes. You have to learn as you go on this adaptive journey. And most important, you have to stay the course and keep going because you've got a mission to accomplish. Last slide. You can do this. You were elected to do this because people believe in you and will follow you. And you probably have more good relationships than you imagine. And you're not alone. God is with you. Trust is critical. Extend it to earn it. Be aware of your strengths. Use them where you can. Leading people at its heart is a privilege. It's not a right. It's not a burden. It's a privilege. You have the opportunity to make lives better through your leadership, and you have the opportunity to make them worse. Be adaptive. Let go, learn as you go, keep going. Build stronger and deeper relationships. If not you, then who? And I'll close by just saying, I hope as you go about the rest of this weekend, you'll think about what you've heard the past 2 Saturdays, and you'll think about what you could do differently as a result of what we've shared with you.